Picture this. Strangers are marching under hissing trees. Their spears and maces are cutting through brush, and shadows start following them. Then boom, the ambush hits. Arrows are covering these warriors, who fight off the Amazonians with slings and piercing thrusts. When it's all over, the travelers patch up the wounded and count their dead. Fighting in the woodlands was always brutal for anyone who wasn't used to it, because this was a frontier, and these strangers were actually soldiers of Tawantinsuyu, the massive Inca empire. This thing stretched over all the land beyond, covering millions of different peoples from the forest edge to the desert coast, and from the southern plains way up to the high peaks. All of it connected by this huge system of roads watched over by castles and monuments. The Inca dynasty came from the mountains. How they ended up ruling so much of the world was a story told to later writers in all kinds of different ways, mixed up with legends and prophecies. And today we know even more from the rocks and bones from that time period. If stories about collapse always grab our attention, well, this is a different kind of story, one that doesn't get told enough. This is about the rise of the Inca Empire. King Viracocha started expanding his pretty modest kingdom through making alliances and fighting wars, listening to advice from his court and the mysterious wisdom of the oracles. The royal history said that among his kids was a son named Inca Urco, who he spoiled rotten with treasures, servants, and concubines. He denied all that luxury to his other son, because Inca Yupanqui was wise, brave, and compassionate, and that's why the king despised and envied him. Chosen by the gods to rule, Viracocha was the eighth in the line of Inca kings, who in the previous 2 centuries had come to rule the city of Cusco and the area right around it. He wanted his favorite son Inca Urco to take over one day, but the Incas had made enemies. A people called the Chancas declared war. Viracocha, Urco, and their men bailed from the city to fortified strongholds. Inca Yupanqui stayed behind, determined that the Golden City wouldn't fall as long as he was still breathing. Up in the mountains, a huge contingent of the Chanca army marched toward Cusco and stormed down the Morning Hills, where Inca Yupanqui and the defenders met them head-on. People said the Creator God sent the Incas help in the form of heavenly warriors. Blood covered the rocks, and finally, Inca Yupanqui stood victorious. He brought the treasures and prisoners of battle to his father, so the king could traditionally display victory by stepping on the defeated. But Viracocha insisted Inca Urco perform the kingly honor instead, and Inca Yupanqui left furious. Viracocha, getting paranoid about his son Inca Yupanqui's rising status, sent men to kill him, but the prince's loyal followers warned him and stopped the attack. Inca Yupanqui came back to Cusco with his men, and then 2 more divisions of Chancas attacked. The bold prince struck down one of their commanders and had the heads of their captains stuck on the points of lances and raised up high. The Chancas ran away in fear, and Inca Yupanqui publicly decorated Cusco with the flayed skins of their leaders, so everyone could see how tough the Incas were. This whole story served as kind of founding legend for the Incas, showing off how righteous the prince was and how the gods favored him. Whether Inca Yupanqui really saved Cusco from a massive Chanca invasion is debatable, but somehow the young prince had proven himself. Probably around the year 1438, Inca Yupanqui got the sacred fringe of rulership wrapped around his head. As emperor or Sapa Inca, he took the name Pachacuti, which roughly means a change of time or the earth shaker. And Pachacuti really was bringing in a new age. The kicked-out Viracocha had come back to the city in submission, and according to one account, Inca Urco tried to take Cusco and got killed by Pachacuti and his men. Pachacuti first took care of the long renovation of Cusco. The city would stretch across the valley and support many thousands of people. Its urban center had planned and paved streets running between temples, forts, and noble residences. Philosophers and great thinkers recorded history, recited sagas, and studied the stars. And the city plazas hosted the arts, dramatic plays, ballads, and sacred festivals. The first people to accept Pachacuti's rule were the neighboring mountain regions, where people guided llamas up misty passes tracing high into the cliffs. These were the regular folks of the Andes, living the way they had for thousands of years. The sun's daily trip over the peaks warmed the rocks and fed the soil. Men and women grew crops including maize, quinoa, and tubers like potatoes. The Andean climate changes dramatically depending on elevation, So communities settled at different altitudes to grow different kinds of food and goods. Stone-sided terraces, filled with gravel and soil, turned slopes into farmable land and held on to heat and moisture, protecting crops against drought and mountain frost. They lived in stone houses. Men wore tunics. Women wore dresses and sashes, with overcloaks on top, while headgear varied by local custom. This clothing was mostly spun from what they got from shearing their llamas and alpacas, which, along with guinea pigs, gave them meat. Community support made this life easier, but in the previous centuries, warring, scattered factions had raided and pillaged all over the place. Pachacuti was now offering the people and their lords the security of the Inca Empire. By the ancient custom of reciprocity, peasants got safety and certain amounts of gifts or food from the state, and in return they had to fulfill the mita, a tax paid in labor. The Incas didn't use money. The head of each household typically owed the empire 2 to 3 months of labor, usually farming, making textiles, or building imperial projects. The Incas limited and rotated labor demands, so they wouldn't take away communities' ability to support themselves. And the empire demanded one more thing from its men: to fight for their king. A lot of lords wouldn't just hand over power to the Incas willingly. While the timeline and details of Inca conquests are different in many accounts, we get a general picture of how they expanded. Early in Pachacuti's reign, a conqueror called Chuchi Capac insisted that the so-called Earthshaker pay respect to him, or else they should meet in battle. And after that, he'd use Pachacuti's skull as a goblet to drink from in victory. Chuchi Capac ruled the Kalas to the southeast. The fearless Pachacuti was going to show them the power of the Incas. The army crossed the mountains and lined up for a pitched battle. The core warriors of Cusco wore helmets and carried shields made of thickly padded cloth, often reinforced with cane. But the Inca army mostly consisted of less equipped regular people, sometimes using cloaks as shields. Maces, spears, halberds, clubs, and slings were their main weapons. At the start of battles, rocks and javelins stunned the enemy before the Incas launched their direct assault, backed up by divisions ready to attack flanks or act as reserves. The Kalas held their ground for hours, until Pachacuti and his guard cut through and captured Chuchi Capac. The enemy's spirit broke, and victory followed. The Incas usually spared captured soldiers, but they were less likely to show the same mercy to enemy commanders. Pachacuti and his army went back to Cusco and publicly beheaded Chuchi Capac. Pachacuti had shaken up the region, and the many lords of the Altiplano submitted. Leaders who freely bent the knee would keep local rule and get imperial privileges and rewards. Those who refused would face the Inca army, which at its peak could number more than 100,000 soldiers. When lined up for battle, the Incas used psychological warfare. One account remembered Incas shouting, "We will drink from the skull of the traitor. We will wear a necklace made of his teeth. We will play the melody of the Pincola with flutes made from his bones. We will beat the drum made from his skin, and that's how we will dance." Most enemies just surrendered, and conquest happened without bloodshed. As the Incas marched into their new territories, they didn't loot or massacre. Instead, Inca officials brought local leaders into the state system, then built storehouses filled with massive stockpiles of food, drink, textiles, and other supplies to be handed out as gifts to the loyal, provisions for those who served the state, or relief during famines. Many storehouses stood high on open hills, constantly visible reminders of how prosperous and generous the Inca overlords were. The emperor was called Huachacoyac, lover of the poor. Each conquered household and lord got properly reported to Cusco. The Incas didn't use a written alphabet or system of pictures. Instead, people from a learned class recorded and relayed information with quipus, knotted cords of different colors attached to a central cord. Understood in the context of its message, the placement of knots and colors encoded exact information. Officials used these to record history, keep inventories of storehouses, take a regular census of the imperial population, and deliver news to and from the war front. Having beaten down the Kalas in the southern territories, Pachacuti had locked down control of the revered Lake Titicaca. This was where Incas believed the creator god named Viracocha brought into existence the sun, moon, and stars. The Incas seriously worshipped the sun god Inti, but recognized Viracocha as the original cause of everything, who filled the world with light, knowledge, and order. It was this creator god who people believed had sculpted statues at the lakeside ruins that totally captured Inca imagination. These monuments, gateways, and abandoned temples were actually the remains of the long-dead Tawantinsuyu civilization, which became urbanized in the 4th century and steadily expanded. Because the Incas didn't represent some sudden rise from a static past of simple villages. The Andean region had flourished as a birthplace of complex states and urban centers for thousands of years. On the coast, the ancient Nazca Confederation built great cities and marked the desert floor with massive drawings of animals and people. And the Great Moche civilization constructed pyramids that now sloped in the sun, their kings buried with their treasures like the pharaohs of old. Portrait vessels showed the Moche mastery of artistic realism, each wrinkle and subtle expression of an ancient people preserved in ceramic. Most of the great powers declined, and by 1000 AD, valleys were abandoned and raiding dominated the broken-up Andes. Now, in the middle of the 15th century, only one power remained that could resist Pachacuti's growing empire. The Chimer Empire ruled over 1 million people along the sandy coast. High walls and statues framed its sprawling capital Chan Chan, whose irrigated farms, streets, and temples may have supported around 30,000 inhabitants. Not intimidated, Pachacuti conquered northwest, through the Peruvian mountains and along the coast. On one of several northern campaigns, Pachacuti sent a brave young commander, his son Tupac Yupanqui. The Incas did espionage before campaigns, identifying enemy weak points and making clay models of the terrain ahead. And so, Prince Tupac Yupanqui led the army through high and dry lands, securing submission and storming forts, until, when the Chimas were nearly surrounded, Tupac Yupanqui followed the Moche River down and threatened to block the coastal water supply. The complete surrender of the Chimer Empire seems to have been gradual and hard-fought, but eventually they submitted to the Incas. Tupac Yupanqui came back to Cusco with many Chimo artisans, who were famous for their silver and goldsmithing and their work in textiles and ceramics. More than any of the emperor's sons, Tupac Yupanqui had proven himself a warrior of determination and cunning, qualities that were crucial for defending and expanding the Inca world. Pachacuti named him as his eventual heir, and may have started to jointly rule the empire with him. With the labor of the conquered, the state produced huge harvests of maize and coca and built great wonders. Royal estates probably built under Pachacuti included the amazing Ollantaytambo and a mountaintop settlement later known as Machu Picchu. There, clouds drifted among temples and residences, with trapezoidal windows and doors, most of it built from stones cut so perfectly together that a knife's edge couldn't fit between them. Cool spring water trickled down the stone aqueducts of Machu Picchu, reaching the royal baths first and flowing out from fountains. All across the empire, the Incas built aqueducts and canals that irrigated farmland and directed water into settlements. Plus, they connected the western edge of the continent like never before. At its peak, the Inca road network measured an estimated 25,000 miles, linking the desert, mountains, and jungle. In certain stretches it was finely paved, with stairs that climbed steep cliffs and walls, drains, and culverts to prevent erosion where needed. Simpler roads branched off to mountain shrines, mines, and settlements. Chasms were crossed by woven bridges. This ambitious empire needed speed and communication more than anything. The Incas set up a system of thousands of messengers or chasquis with impressive stamina, who constantly manned waypoints every 5 miles or so along the main roads. The previous runner signaled his arrival with a conch shell, repeated his message word for word, and often delivered a quipu. This way, Inca messages could travel about 170 miles in 24 hours. Communication that took weeks by horseback in the colonial era, the chasqui system pulled off in just days. This growing system let experienced Inca generals lead armies on campaigns of conquest or consolidation. Tupac Yupanqui's travels along the coast brought him to the foot of the enemy fortress of Ungara. Their stones and lances pushed back his attacks, and he pulled back. When the defenders left to celebrate their victory, the hidden Incas slaughtered them along the coast and decorated the fortress with the swaying bodies of the enemy. To make sure people stayed loyal after conquest, the Incas seized local items of worship to be kept in Cusco, the captive relics discouraged rebellion, and made the capital a place of pilgrimage. As the years went by, Pacacuti's armies also conquered far north into the tough terrain of Ecuador. Tupac Yupanqui and his men came to the island of Puna, where chronicles say he met merchants on sailing rafts who told him about distant populated islands they'd visited. Tupac Yupanqui supposedly undertook a 9-month voyage and came back with people and goods. Though the account might have been made up, later writers guessed that he'd reached Galapagos or even Rapa Nui, known as Easter Island. Genetic and plant evidence do show that Polynesians made contact with South Americans before Europeans arrived. Whether the Incas were involved is way less certain. Tupac Yupanqui and massive Inca armies were way more used to long journeys by land. The Incas forbade their soldiers from looting the innocent countryside, so a big chunk of military caravans was made up of porters and llamas to haul provisions. Along the way, settlements had to support the armies, and at regular intervals along the road, the Incas installed storehouses full of weapons, clothing, and food. People of the Andes preserved certain foods by an ancient method of freeze-drying that combined dehydration and exposure to the elements. Freeze-dried meat was called charqui, where we get the word jerky from. After one brutal march east, Tupac Yupanqui and the Incas entered the Amazon. Sweet-smelling plants and weird creatures fascinated the Incas, but the woods were also home to countless people. Conquest went more smoothly where large powers could surrender on behalf of huge regions. The forest was different. Small victories still earned the Incas colorful feathers, gold and honey, and new subjects. Expansion diversified the Inca army, which came to include bowmen from the forest and troops from the desert. Far from being all the same, the empire would include millions of people with different traditions and faiths who spoke over 150 languages. The Incas, for their part, spoke Quechua and made the language an imperial common tongue. According to the Incas, their conquests were partly driven by a mission to civilize the world. Beyond their state religion, they followed well-defined ethics and norms. They condemned cannibalism and eating dog meat. They'd punished adultery and suspected witchcraft and praised family. A growing population strengthened the empire. In some regions, provincial governors arranged marriages between unmarried commoners. It was probably after his first trip into the Amazon that Tupac Yupanqui returned to the aging Pachacuti, who told him, "Son, you now see how many great nations I leave to you, and you know what work they've cost me. Make sure you're the man to keep and expand them. When I'm dead, take care of my body, so I may go to rest with my father the sun." The death of the great Emperor Pachacuti sent a shock through a world filled with divine will and ancestral spirits. The Incas marked his death by offering to gods what was most precious to them. Treasures were buried or destroyed, thousands of llamas slaughtered, and hundreds of people sacrificed, young people from across the empire, who would join their king in death. Sacrifice had been practiced for thousands of years in Andean societies, and though the Incas didn't practice it consistently or on a massive scale, they turned to it in times of natural disaster and changes of rulership. Pacacuti's story didn't end with his death. The Incas believed the dead took another form, that their essence stayed bound to the body. The mummies of former kings and queens continued to live in estates, attended to by their relatives and consulted by shamans on imperial matters. Even so, active kingship passed to Tupac Yupanqui, who mourned his father, and then gathered his troops to return with fresh energy to the jungle. Despair and confusion were waiting for them. The story said the forests were really dense and full of evil places, so they couldn't force their way through and didn't know what direction to take. The Sapa Inca would get the submission of many, but fighting and sickness haunted their wandering march, until finally a general rescued the lost emperor. While he was gone, the Kalas had led a revolt, killing Inca officials and retreating to forts. In times of rebellion, smoke signals could quickly alert the empire crisis. Tupac swiftly raised an army tens of thousands strong, crushed the Kalas, and turned the skins of their captains into drums. Most conquered territories were subject to the mitma, the mass resettlement policy of the Incas. The empire forcibly moved hundreds of thousands of people. Chunks of rebellious populations like Kalas were scattered from their homelands, with loyal subjects sent to replace them. Other populations were just moved to work less developed regions. With the rebellions crushed, it may have been then that Tupac Yupanqui conquered into Argentina and far into Chile, stopping only around the Mall River. Some records show that the Incas clashed with the mighty Mapuche people in a costly multi-day battle. Whether weakened by the march or warfare, Tupac Yupanqui turned his armies back. The Incas called their growing empire Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters. Each of these parts was managed by a governor, with lower officials overseeing the over 80 provinces across the empire. This refined system of governance managed the labor of hundreds of thousands of subjects. Endless were the brilliant textiles, gold, food, and drink that flowed into the capital and other major cities. In Cusco, Tupac Yupanqui continued building great works, including Sacsayhuaman, a towering temple or fortress made up of a tower and elaborate buildings, on top of several levels of massive walls, made from gigantic boulders cut, pulled, and by some clever process, lifted and perfectly fitted together. Decades later, a European visitor would write it was the greatest castle his countrymen had ever seen. And these walls are the most beautiful thing that can be seen of all the constructions. They are such big stones that no one who sees them would say that they have been placed there by the hand of man. As Tupac Yupanqui knew well, his powerful throne would one day pass from father to son, while a Sapa Inca would marry many secondary wives for alliance purposes. He was supposed to devote himself to a queen who wielded influence and whose children alone could be legitimate heirs. Intimate relations between cousins or closer relatives were forbidden to commoners, but among the royals it strengthened family power and security. Tupac years before took as his primary wife his own full sister, Mama Aklo, who gave him a capable son named Huayna Capac. When the great conqueror Tupac Yupanqui died, around the year 1493, the royal bloodline was spilled in a fight for succession until finally Huayna Capac emerged as the new Sapa Inca. He ordered campaigns in the east and far north and led armies against rebellious peoples. When he advanced on a fortress of stubborn people in the north, he got thrown from his litter and nearly fell into enemy hands. The shame was avenged quickly. The Incas chased these enemies to the water's edge and massacred them, so much that afterward the lake was called Yawarkicha, the Lake of Blood. Huayna Capac devoted his years of rule mostly to maintaining the empire. On high hills, watchful forts stood against the harassing raids of border peoples. The Incas had conquered the sands, mountains, the grassy valleys, and the edge of the jungle, and found no power that threatened Cusco. These were the days of the Pax Incaica, a land once dominated by constant warfare, now a vast corridor of enforced peace. Inca rule, which at once resettled, dominated, and demanded from its people, also brought prosperity, high crop yields, infrastructure, and stable safety for the common family. Maybe it was through the audacity and brilliance of Pachacuti and his sons that the Incas of Cusco came to rule such an extensive domain, but this was a grand and mighty empire inhabited, defended and built by millions of people. Sometime after the year 1520, a terrible plague started sweeping across the land. It claimed the life of Huayna Capac and his designated heir. Many believe this was a wave of smallpox, from a far-off instance of contact with people from a distant world. Late in the reign of Huayna Capac, there had been people with pale skin seen along the imperial borders. Now, as the plague-stricken Incas fell into a civil war for the throne, more were coming. The advance guard of an unknown empire, the swords of Spain.